So picture this for a moment. You have a local crisis erupting, I mean, really erupting. And this crisis is rooted in a direct conflict between community members and federal agents. And then all of a sudden, a centuries-old law gets pulled out of like the deepest archives and used as a political threat. We're talking about a moment when the federal government and local officials found themselves on an absolute terrifying collision course.
That's exactly where our source material puts us today. We're doing a deep dive into that threat, the one by President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. And it was during a really specific period of intense civil unrest right in Minneapolis. The sources we looked at give us this unique view of the chaos on the ground, the high-level legal maneuvering, and just the instantaneous political friction that this whole threat created.
Right. So our mission here is to really unpack the specific context of what was happening in Minneapolis, what was the catalyst. Then we need to understand the Insurrection Act itself. It's a term a lot of people have heard, but I think few really grasp what it is. And finally, we'll get into the immediate, really tense responses from officials to this threat of, domestic military deployment. We're really going to focus on separating the facts of what happened and the law behind it from all the political noise that was surrounding it.
It's really the ultimate case study. You're looking at the friction points between federal executive authority and local officials who are just trying to manage a very fragile situation. It's critical context for anyone who's interested in how these crises can escalate when, different levels of government just can't agree on what order even means.
Okay, so let's unpack that spark. When we talk about unrest in Minneapolis, we have to look past the general idea of protests. We need to drill down into the emotional core of what was happening on the ground. Our sources really emphasize this wasn't just some generalized dissatisfaction. The demonstrations were explicitly centered on federal immigration enforcement actions.
Absolutely. The unrest wasn't abstract at all. It had specific, recent, and very localized triggers that created what you could, I think, accurately call a powder keg. It was all happening just before the president's threat landed.
Okay, so tell us more about those specific incidents, because they really do provide the foundation for everything that came next.
Yeah, the sources point to two incidents that were extremely raw, just top of mind for all the demonstrators. First, and this was the most recent one, just earlier that week, a federal officer shot a man in the leg.
A federal officer.
Yes, during an enforcement operation in North Minneapolis. And that action, being carried out by a federal agent, just created this immediate and intense localized fury.
A shooting by a federal agent during an enforcement action. I mean, that's a clear, direct, and immediate catalyst for the community to act against that federal presence.
Precisely. And this localized fury was then compounded because it came just days after another, just a truly tragic incident that amplified the community's grief and anger. The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good.
Ah, right.
And while that wasn't directly linked to the federal agent's actions, this atmosphere of, deep mistrust and anger was already there in the community. So the federal shooting then just acted as the final straw. It directly manifested in these demonstrations happening right near the sites of those federal operations.
So the community's response, the unrest, it was a direct reaction to the actions of federal agents themselves. That is such a vital detail because it sets up this profound irony of the federal response that followed.
It certainly does. The idea that a problem caused by one part of the federal government could be solved by introducing the military arm of the federal government, well, that's what makes this case so complex.
That context is just so vital. Okay, let's move to that federal response. We know the president delivered a pretty severe threat, and he did it via a social media post, which instantly took this local crisis and made it a national flashpoint by invoking one of the most powerful and rarely used tools the executive branch has.
Right. And what stands out in the sources is the precise language he used in that ultimatum. The president stated he would consider using the Insurrection Act if Minnesota officials failed to, and this is a quote, obey the law.
Obey the law.
Yes, and he didn't just refer to generic rioters. He specifically targeted his opposition. He defined them as professional agitators and insurrectionists. And he said they were actively targeting Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or IC agents.
The word insurrectionists, that is incredibly charged language. It suggests like a high-level plot, an organized attempt to overthrow authority, not just a spontaneous protest reacting to specific events on the ground. What does using that word tell us about the political strategy here?
It just changes the entire tenor of the event. By framing the unrest not as a social issue or a response to federal overreach, but as an insurrection, the president immediately shifts the available response. You go from domestic policing to, well, wartime authority.
Wow.
And his stated goal was simple: to quickly put an end to what he was characterizing as a total failure of state and local officials to maintain order.
And that failure, in his view, justified the ultimate federal response, which would be the domestic deployment of U.S. military forces.
Okay.
Let's unpack this. We've heard the term Insurrection Act thrown around, but for listeners who maybe haven't studied constitutional law, what exactly is this law? And why is invoking it so politically and legally explosive?
That really is the key question. And I think before we can define the Insurrection Act, we have to define the rule that it breaks. Normally in the United States, we operate under a foundational law. It's known as the Posse Comitatus Act.
Which translates roughly from Latin as power of the county, right?
Exactly. The Posse Comitatus Act, it dates all the way back to 1878, and its main function is to maintain this very strict wall between the military and civilian law enforcement. It prohibits using the Army or the Air Force, and by policy extension, other branches too, for domestic police work.
So things like making arrests or searches, crowd control.
All of it. It's a core principle of civil liberties in the U.S., and it's designed to ensure that we don't live in a military state.
So posse comitatus is the standard. The military stays out of domestic policing,
Right.
Period.
Correct. The Insurrection Act, however, is the centuries-old, very rarely used legal override to posse comitatus. It grants the president sweeping authority to deploy active-duty U.S. military forces, domestically on U.S. soil. And the conditions for its use are broad. It can be invoked during an insurrection, domestic violence, or a conspiracy that hinders the execution of law, essentially making it impossible for the local community to govern itself.
That phrase, hindering the execution of law, that sounds incredibly subjective. I mean, it seems ripe for political interpretation. So if the president decides local officials are simply failing to obey the law, as he claimed in his threat, does the Insurrection Act really just give him the final legal word?
Well, that's the crux of the debate, isn't it? While the sources show the president was asserting that power, the act itself requires a pretty high threshold. The disorder has to rise to a level where the government structure itself is effectively broken down.
Okay.
And when the threat was issued, you had civil liberties advocates and Democratic officials immediately raising very serious concerns because they felt the situation in Minneapolis, while it was chaotic, it had not met that threshold.
So the legal argument against using it was basically that the cure deploying federal troops would actually be far worse than the disease it was supposed to fix?
Absolutely. The argument was that introducing armed military units into a confrontation that was already fueled by mistrust of federal agents, it wouldn't restore order. It would do the opposite. It would further inflame tensions, and it could lead to, potentially violent confrontations and a massive constitutional crisis about federal overreach.
Right. And this just highlights the immense political risk of even issuing the threat. It's not just a physical threat of troops on the street. It's a legal challenge to the fundamental separation between military and civilian authority in the country.
Now, what's fascinating here is that the sources reveal that even the threat itself immediately impacted the political calculation of the local leaders on the ground. It basically forced their hand.
So let's shift focus to them, the local officials. They are already grappling with this on-the-ground chaos we've been talking about, and now they have this massive federal threat hanging over their heads. How did Minneapolis City Hall handle that incredible pressure?
The response was really a study in contrast. Even within the city leadership, we saw a very clear division of roles. You had Police Chief Brian O'Hara, who, speaking in a news conference, was focused purely on de-escalation.
Okay.
He publicly acknowledged that, yes, some protesters were engaging in unlawful behavior, and he urgently pleaded with those gathered at the scene to disperse. His priority was just restoring immediate local order to protect the community.
So the police chief is appealing to the crowd to calm down, which, you could argue, simultaneously addresses the local disorder while also undermining the president's whole rationale for intervening. But the mayor, Jacob Frey, he took a very different tack, didn't he? A much more critical stance toward the federal government.
He was much, much sharper. Mayor Frey offered this searing criticism of the federal agents' conduct, the very conduct that caused the unrest in the first place. He called some of their actions disgusting and intolerable. So he was validating the community's anger, acknowledging that the federal government had created the conditions for this chaos.
That's a really crucial but also conflicted dual message for the mayor to deliver. He's saying, I see why you're angry at the federal agents, but at the same time, he's having to manage the consequences of that anger. So how did he appeal to the residents to stop the chaos without sounding like he was just capitulating to the president.
Yeah, that appeal was a desperate political tightrope walk. He had to criticize the federal government while urgently asking residents not to play into the federal narrative that justified military intervention. And our sources capture his message directly, and it's, I think, a profound political statement. He said, "We cannot counter Donald Trump's chaos with our own brand of chaos."
Wow. That quote perfectly encapsulates the impossible position of local leadership. They're essentially saying, we agree the federal conduct was bad, but if you continue this unrest, you are providing the president with the legal justification, however tenuous it might be, to use the Insurrection Act, which will turn this into a catastrophe.
And that decision to go home, it becomes a strategic move against federal overreach. It's not just a matter of public safety. The mayor was basically asking the residents to sacrifice their immediate protest action for the greater goal of denying the president a legal pretext for military deployment.
So if we synthesize this whole conflict, the core irony really comes into sharp focus. The conflict began because of local outrage directed at federal agents, specifically ICE. And the president's proposed solution was to send in federal soldiers to police that crowd. It's the ultimate escalation of federal power, responding to a problem that the federal government, essentially created.
Precisely. The debate that was revived by the president's threat, it wasn't just about restoring order. It was fundamentally about whether military force is an effective or even appropriate tool to resolve civil disorder, especially when that disorder stems from a prior conflict with federal authorities. When you introduce a military solution to what is really a police and a political problem, you risk just exacerbating the underlying tensions rather than, truly solving them.
And the existence of the Insurrection Act, this centuries-old legal relic, it just acts as the ultimate threat multiplier in this kind of scenario.
It does. It shapes the entire strategic landscape for both the president, who sees it as this kind of nuclear option to assert control, and for local officials, who have to navigate that incredibly fine line between allowing protests and risking a military occupation.
We've covered a remarkable amount of really complex ground here. We started with the specific, painful local incidents, the fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good and the shooting of a man by a federal officer, which, fueled this intense unrest centered around federal enforcement actions. We then analyzed the threat, delivered via social media, to use the centuries-old Insurrection Act, defining it clearly in opposition to the Posse Comitatus Act.
And we close by examining that nuanced, really conflicted response from local officials like Mayor Frey, who had to balance the sharp criticism of federal conduct with a desperate strategic appeal to residents to de-escalate, to deny the president the justification for calling in the troops.
It serves as such a potent, immediate case study on the intense friction points between different levels of government during a crisis. But before we finish, I do want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought that kind of builds on all this material.
Yeah, so given that the Insurrection Act is a centuries-old law, and it's rarely used, what is the significance of its power being invoked in our current era? An era that's defined by rapid-fire communication, social media virality, and hyper-local unrest. I mean, the law was written for a time when communication took weeks, not milliseconds.
Does the ease and speed with which that threat was delivered, a single social media post, does that change how we have to view this ancient executive authority?
How does the mere existence of such a broad, rarely used authority, suddenly made visible and immediate through a public threat, how does that shape the inherent tension between federal power and local governance? That's the question that continues to shape our political crises long after the immediate unrest has quieted down.
Indeed. It just shows you how quickly these long dormant laws can be pulled from the archives and made central to the modern political playbook. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We'll talk to you next time.